I loved Eric for 12 years, only to end up in prison. 3 years of imprisonment left me with a body full of ailments. After getting out of prison, Eric said, "Why didn't you die in there?" As he wished, I died soon after, of brain cancer. When I died, he went mad. I had known Eric for 12 years and loved him for the same 12 years. It was love at first sight, I guess. When did I start falling in love with him? It was from the moment he rescued me from the orphanage. I thought he would be my salvation. I was wrong. He said to me gently, "Tony, you set Anne's villa on fire, causing her to suffer extensive burns. From now on, you can reflect on your actions inside." He was like a lunatic. The gentler he was, the more dangerous he became. I was terrified to the extreme and cried, begging him to believe me. To believe that I didn't set fire to his first love's villa. But he didn't believe me. In the end, I ended up in prison. At the entrance of Beijing prison, I limped out of the prison gate with my numb and uncoordinated legs. The prison guard said to me, "Go out and be a good person. Once you step out, don't look back." I opened my mouth slightly, wanting to say something, but in the end, I weakly closed my lips, and left without looking back. There were hardly any vehicles around, and no one came to pick me up, so I had to hobble along. This was the suburbs, with only one highway. I was walking on the far right when a Bentley drove towards me with no intention of stopping. I was so scared that I took several steps back. I stumbled and sat down directly, my butt hurting badly. I resigned myself to closing my eyes. It would be better to die. Death would mean liberation. There was no expected pain. I opened my eyes, still shaken. The Bentley had stopped less than 2 centimeters away from me. A person got out of the car. I looked up, trying to see who it was. The midday sun was high in the sky. In that instant, it stung my eyes so badly that I quickly lowered my gaze. However, I could be sure that the person was Eric. Even if I had only seen his silhouette just now, I could recognize him accurately. He walked up to me and crouched down. I met his indifferent and deep eyes. He sneered and said, "This scares you? TSK, why weren't you this timid when you set the fire?" His tone was slightly contemptuous. Seeing that I didn't speak, he gradually lost his patience and suddenly looked at me with a gloomy face. He grabbed my neck and said, "Why didn't you die in prison?" I tilted my head back, and the stray hairs on my forehead slid back. Eric saw and said with disgust, "Ugly," and then let me go. He dragged me into the car. Before I could sit properly, he suddenly started the vehicle. With my trembling hands, I grabbed the door handle, trying to steady myself. The car stopped at an auction. I couldn't hold on any longer. I opened the door and vomited violently. There was no food in my stomach, and all I vomited was acid. I only heard Eric say to the attendant, "Clean her up and send her to the auction." Then he added, "Clean the car too. It's dirty." My body froze. Was he going to auction me off? I tried to run away, but with my crippled leg, I was caught after just a few steps. I wanted to shout for help, but my throat seemed blocked, and I couldn't make a sound. I was stripped naked and let them scrub me. I stared blankly ahead, like a soulless puppet, being manipulated by others. They dressed me in sexy clothes. Or rather, it was just a few pieces of cloth that could cover the important parts. At the auction venue, the auctioneer was announcing the last item. That item was me. I was put in a glass water tank. There were a few small fish inside. But I wasn't a mermaid. I wanted to struggle, but the top was sealed. There were only a few holes for me to breathe. But the more I struggled, the more excited they got. My appearance made the scene boil over. Everyone stood up. The starting price is 800,000 yuan. 900,000 yuan. 1 million yuan. Those looks of seeing me as prey made me want to vomit. I opened my eyes slightly and looked at Eric sitting at the top. He was looking at me with a faint smile, his gaze gentle. But I was afraid of his gentle gaze and tone. He slightly raised the sign in his hand and said casually, 100 million yuan. He had no intention of letting me go. He just wanted to humiliate me in this way. I couldn't hold on any longer. A large amount of water flooded into my stomach. I was like a dead fish, slowly sinking to the bottom of the glass water tank. When I woke up, what I saw was a white ceiling and a strong smell of disinfectant. I moved my body and felt pain everywhere. Are you awake? A nurse's voice came from beside my ear. She was changing my foredrip. I didn't respond to her. I stared at the water on the bedside table and licked my lips, wanting to drink. I struggled to sit up. The nurse told me not to move, saying that I had been running a fever for 2 days and probably didn't have any strength at now. So I had been running a fever for 2 days. After drinking the water, I heard voices from outside the door. It was Eric. Seeing him, I felt a bit scared. He was always like this, looking at me with gentle and affectionate eyes. Somehow, I felt scared. Sure enough, he gently lifted me into a wheelchair because I was completely exhausted and had no strength left. I nervously gripped the armrests of the wheelchair, not knowing where he was going to take me. At the blood-drawing window, a nurse asked Eric hesitantly, "Miss Lou is still a patient. Are you sure you want to draw her blood?" Eric glanced at me and said softly, "Draw." I was powerless to resist. There was nothing Eric wanted to do that he couldn't achieve. 200 cubic centimeters, 400 cubic centimeters. I don't know how much was drawn. Everything went black before my eyes, and I founced out. When I woke up again, it was already dark. I heard the gossip outside the door. Basically, Eric was using my blood for his first love, and because both and I had a special blood type. The reason and fainted was because of me. I heard that after the big fire that year, and suffered extensive burns and had been anemic ever since, often needing blood transfusions. It just so happened that there was no blood in the blood bank today. So they drew mine. I numbly pulled up the quilt, wanting to block out those voices. But I couldn't. I sat up resentfully. My left hand had no strength left. Because of the blood drawing. I reached out with my right hand and took an apple from the bedside of the next bed. I didn't wash it and took a bite directly. But it took me a long time to swallow it. I should have not eaten for 3 days. 2 days of fever plus the day I got out of prison. The aunt next door glanced at me but didn't say anything, which was a tacit agreement for me to eat it, probably because she pitied me. I leaned against the headboard, staring at the apple in my hand, eating it very slowly. I had been eating it for half an hour, but I hadn't even eaten half of it. Suddenly, a dark figure blocked my light. I looked up and saw that it was Eric. What was he doing here? Was he going to draw blood again? I glanced at him and then lowered my eyelids. I was really afraid of his gaze. It was so gentle, but why? The things he did were so terrifying. I stared at the oxidizing apple, waiting for him to say something. He didn't speak, and I didn't dare to eat. Until he pulled up a chair and sat down. I then looked at him again, looking at him with a puzzled expression. Then I hurriedly looked away. He leaned back in the chair, looking at me casually. He sneered and said, "Are you afraid of me?" I nodded obediently. I still remember when we were in college, Eric asked me if he was scary. Because many girls both loved and feared Eric. But no matter how hard it was, he had never abandoned me. He had raised me until now, and he had because for N's sake, he had bankrupted the families of those rich kids who had tried to make a move on and, the campus beauty. At that time, I didn't know because I was still a high school student and wasn't very clear about what was going on in college. I only remember my answer back then was, no, Eric is the best Eric in the world. I smiled brightly, completely different from now. In the end, I also became like those girls, afraid of him. When Eric saw my obedient appearance, he reached out his hand. I reflexively crossed my hands to protect my head, and the apple in my hand rolled onto the floor. After waiting for a moment and not feeling any pain, I carefully moved my hands away. Was he going to hit me? His hand was frozen in midair. I put my hand down. I closed my eyes, resigned to being at his mercy. Forget it. Let him hit me. People in prison had hit me before. One more time wouldn't matter. Then he put his hand on my head and rubbed it, saying, "Be good." I couldn't understand him. It's quite ridiculous. I had known him for 12 years plus 3 years in prison, 15 years in total, but I couldn't understand him at all. I nodded obediently. I was like a fish on the chopping block, at his mercy. He seemed satisfied with my appearance. He ordered a bowl of porridge for me and watched me eat it. I ate very slowly. I only drank the porridge and didn't touch the meat in it. Eric seemed dissatisfied with this. Be good. Eat the meat too. I hesitated for a second and then ate the meat. A wave of nausea hit my stomach. I couldn't hold it in any longer and vomited out everything I had just eaten. With a sharp pain in my stomach, I covered my stomach with a pale face. Eric called a doctor for me. I was pushed to have a gastroscopy. Gastritis. The doctor put down the X-ray film and pushed up his glasses, asking Eric, "Is the patient mute?" When I asked her during the gastroscopy, she didn't say anything. I was sitting beside listening, and the doctor's words made Eric pause for a moment. It seemed that I just realized that I hadn't spoken a word since getting out of prison. I had another examination. There was severe damage to my vocal cords. Can it be cured? It's been too long. It's probably very difficult. During the big fire that year, and was trapped in the villa. Eric dragged me in to save her, saying that if we couldn't find her, I would be buried with her, and was found, but I was trapped inside. I inhaled a large amount of smoke. Finally, the firefighters rescued me. Because I didn't take good care of myself, I lost my voice just a few days after being in prison. As if remembering something, Eric asked the doctor to examine my leg. The doctor felt around my knee through my pants. The final conclusion was that I had had a fracture before and it hadn't been treated in time. It was estimated that it would be like this for the rest of my life. Probably exhausted from all the commotion, I fell asleep while the doctor was writing out the prescriptions. I woke up as soon as Eric approached me, looking at him with a guarded expression. His hands froze in mid-air again, not knowing whether to hug me or not. Finally, I was stiffly carried back to the ward by him, a VIP ward. I gestured to him, saying that I had no money. As if I could afford a regular ward anyway. I didn't know if he could understand me. Seeing that he didn't react, I picked up the pen and paper on the bedside table. Before I could write anything, he said, "Work as my nanny to pay off the medical bills." I was just about to shake my head. I could work elsewhere and then transfer the money to him. I wanted to escape from him. No refusal. His uncompromising words reached my ears. Eric left on some business. I had another bowl of porridge and then went to sleep. In a half-asleep and half-awake state, I felt someone staring at me, as if they wanted to cut me into pieces. The bright moonlight shone through the window. I saw that person looking at me with a gloomy face. I shuddered. I quickly sat up. At this moment, I really wanted to go back to the ward of the aunt next door. I didn't know this person, but she was really good-looking, as if carved out stroke by stroke. Seeing that I didn't speak, the woman's sinister words came, "What? Don't recognize me anymore?" The voice was so familiar. It seemed to be Anne. She had had plastic surgery. No wonder her face was so delicate. Anxiety and fear surged up all at once. She picked up a knife from the side and played with it. "Do you want to taste what it's like to be disfigured?" She was as crazy as Eric. I frantically pressed the call bell on the bedside. This was a VIP ward, and soon hurried footsteps could be heard. But Anne pounced on me like a madwoman. I grabbed the knife she was about to stab with. I had originally wanted to grab her hand, but it was too late. Blood flowed out of my hand. Suddenly, she dragged me, and it became that I was pressing on her. She threw away the knife in her hand, then grabbed my hand and put it on her neck. She pinched my wound and pulled me over like that. I was pulled away by someone. There were 2 bright red handprints on Anne's neck. "What's going on?" Eric's sharp voice came from beside my ear. He seemed angry. Was it because I had hurt Anne? I stared at the blood continuously flowing out of my hand and actually felt a hint of pleasure. I even wanted to pick up the knife on the ground and make a few more cuts. Thinking like this, I also did it. Just as I picked up the knife, Eric's scolding voice came again. "What are you standing there for? Bandage it." Eric scolded the doctors, and my mind seemed to be pulled back. I stared blankly at the knife in my hand, completely without the impulse I had just had. "Can't you see where the wound is?" The doctors were scolded by Eric again because they were all surrounding Anne. And I was still squatting on the ground, holding the knife. Then the doctor also squatted down, taking iodine tincture and disinfectant to bandage my wound. I watched the white bubbles coming out. It was the disinfectant working. I swallowed. It seemed that I couldn't feel the pain. Instead, I could feel a sense of excitement. Strangely, I felt really good. This feeling didn't disappear until he had bandaged me up. There were only the three of us left in the ward. The blood on Anne's neck had also been cleaned up, and was the first to speak. She said, "Eric, I heard that sister was staying next to me, so I came to visit." "Who knows, sister," she. And didn't continue, looking as if she had suffered a great injustice. "Those who understand, understand." I didn't explain either because Eric wouldn't believe me. 3 years ago, I couldn't explain myself even with a mouth. Moreover, now I was mute. Eric seemed interested. I couldn't understand him. He raised his eyebrows and looked at Anne beside him, asking with interest, "Oh? What did Tony just say to you?" "She said she would take you away from me, kill me, and also said that she should have burned me to death 3 years ago." She was crying pitifully, looking so pitiful that one would feel sorry for her. But I could see her slightly raised chin, as if showing off to me that Eric was hers and that Eric would believe whatever she said. But the thing she shouldn't have said was, I said, because I was mute now. "And, why didn't you ask the nurses in the hospital clearly before coming?" Eric looked at Anne with an ambiguous expression, and looked at Eric with a puzzled expression. Eric didn't explain and just asked Anne to go back first, and knew that Eric liked obedient women. Eric tapped the armrest of the chair intermittently with his fingers, as if thinking about something. "Tell me, which of you two is a better actress?" He propped his chin with his hand and stared at me with a faint smile. If it were in the past, I would surely be lost in his smile, unable to extricate myself. His gaze didn't allow me to dodge even a little. I could only keep my head down. I didn't dare to look at him. The gentler he was, the more dangerous he was. What he meant by his words was that either I was pretending to be mute to deceive him or Anne was lying. I didn't say anything. Oh, no, I couldn't say anything now. I didn't even want to gesture with my fingers. It was only later that I realized that the hand that had been cut was really painful. Even if I explained, he wouldn't listen. He didn't believe me. The pain in my hand plus Eric's gaze made me break out in a cold sweat. It was only when Eric's phone beeped that he looked away. I secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Then, his gaze was back on me again, even more fierce. Could that message just now be from Anne to him? His eyes seemed to want to swallow me alive. Then he said, "You can be discharged from the hospital tomorrow. Go to sleep early." Even if he didn't say it, I felt that he was holding back some big move. A big move to deal with me. So much so that I couldn't sleep all night. In the second half of the night, I was still wide awake. I sat up, staring at Eric lying on the sofa. He looked a bit childish when he was asleep. He seemed to sense it and opened his eyes, scolding in a low voice. I shuddered. I lifted the quilt and hid inside, hearing that Eric didn't seem to have any intention of coming over. I finally fell asleep after a long while. 3 years later, I returned to the villa where I had lived for 12 years. It had been too long. It had been renovated, but the things inside were restored exactly the same. To my surprise, my things were still there. I didn't ask, nor did I dare to. I thought that when I came back to pay off the medical bills, Eric would make things really difficult for me. But no, on the contrary, I ate and drank well every day. And I didn't have to do any work. I lived in fear every day, afraid that if I angered Eric, he would unleash the big move he was holding back. But living in fear every day, my heart would ache faintly from time to time. I picked up the piece of paper I had written on and sat obediently on the sofa waiting for Eric to come back from work. At 5:30, Eric came back. I handed the paper to him. The gauze on my hand had been removed, leaving a deep scar, but I didn't care. Eric raised his eyebrows and took it. I kept my head down, looking at my toes. What I had written on the paper was, "Are you holding back some big move?" Because I couldn't gesture these things. He walked to the sofa and sat down. What big move do you think I'm holding back? I stood neatly beside him and shook my head at him. Suddenly, he pulled me onto his lap. I was stiff and didn't dare to move, not even a little. I knew that my pride had long gone. Beside him, what was the difference between me and a soft persimmon? He raised his hand and pinched my chin, forcing me to look at him. It hurt a bit. Are you afraid of me? His eyes narrowed slightly. Again with this question. I nodded as usual. I didn't know if it was my illusion, but I seemed to see a flash of disappointment in his eyes. It seemed that this wasn't the answer he wanted. He pulled me into his arms. His hand accidentally landed on my leg. I reflexively pulled away. An abnormal pull. Eric forcibly pulled down my pants. There were scars of various sizes and new wounds that hadn't healed on my thigh. Eric's face visibly darkened. What's going on? I didn't respond to Eric because I didn't know what was going on either. When I couldn't sleep at night, I would unconsciously pick up a knife and make a cut on my thigh. There was no pain, only a sense of excitement. It seemed that only in that way could I feel that I was still alive. Half an hour later, the doctor came. Severe depression. So I have depression? No wonder I have the tendency to self-harm. After seeing the doctor off, Eric was treating my wounds with the medicine prescribed by the doctor. The new wounds were a bit red, and the old ones were inflamed. Eric was sullen and didn't say a word. Why did I feel that he was angry? After dealing with the wounds, Eric said, I wasn't holding back any big moves. I nodded numbly. Then I heard him say again, I watched the surveillance footage of the ward that day. Why was there surveillance in the ward? But I don't understand the world of crazy people. But with what he said, did it mean that he believed me? His gaze was fixed on me as he said again, if that day, I hadn't gone to ask someone to check the surveillance, were you not going to explain? Explain? Explain what? Would you listen even if I explained? Not necessarily. After having dinner, I went back to my room and fell asleep. It was just a little after 7. In a daze, I felt one side of the bed sink. It was Eric. My eyelids were so heavy. I felt as if someone touched my forehead. Not long after, it seemed that a wet towel was placed on my forehead. The quilt was also lifted, and the burning wound on my leg became cool. It seemed that I had a fever caused by the inflamed wound. In just 1 week, I had a fever twice. I felt that soon, I would be reunited with my parents. I'm an orphan. I've never seen my parents. I just assume they're dead. I was adopted by Eric when I was 10. I had a wandering life since childhood and would often get a fever. Eric took care of me like this back then. These days, Eric hadn't gone to the company. I felt so uncomfortable with him staying here. As a result, we just sat on the sofa doing nothing. He looked at me, and I looked at my legs. A warm current flowed out of my nose. It dripped onto my hand. In the hospital, Eric was holding the examination report, and the veins on his hands were bulging. Brain cancer. And it was already in the advanced stage. It seemed that I was about to regard the hospital as my home. Tony. Eric suddenly called my name. I froze for a moment while playing with the examination report. It had been a long time. He hadn't called me like that for a long time. Since I was adopted by him, I took his surname. Before that, I didn't have a name. I really liked it when he called me Tony back then. I was a person with a name too. I looked up at the man in front of me. He was looking at me with bloodshot eyes. He said, let's go home. Then he picked me up. I stared at his chin. He seemed really sad. What was he sad about? On the day I got out of prison, he said, why didn't you die in there? Now that I'm dying, why isn't he happy instead? The doctor prescribed a lot of medicine for me, for depression and for brain cancer. I didn't take any of them. Anyway, I'm going to die in the end. Those medicines taste so bad. Eric hadn't gone to the company for a long time. There were a lot of business affairs waiting for him to handle. As soon as Eric left, and came right after, I looked at her, and she looked at me. Finally, she smiled. She said she never expected that I would become mute. She also said that even though Eric knew she was lying, he didn't expose her, and that Eric loved her. She also said, since you've become mute, you can take the secret that it was me who set the fire that year to hell with you. She laughed crazily. I ignored her and looked at the person behind her. Anne's face changed, and she slowly turned around. Eric suddenly came back. I knew that Eric had heard everything. As for whether he would defend Anne or not, I didn't know. Anne tried to control her emotions, but her trembling lips betrayed her. Eric simply walked past the two of us and went back into the villa. Was he just going to let it go? It would be a lie to say that I wasn't disappointed. Sure enough, the one being loved has nothing to fear. Then I saw Eric come out of the house with a baseball bat. He held one end in his hand and dragged the other end on the ground. Like an Azura, he walked towards me step by step. I saw Anne showing a smug smile at the corner of her mouth. I laughed at myself self-deprecatingly. Then he turned me around and said, "Be good, don't look." Not long after, and screams of pain came from behind. Driven by curiosity, I still turned my head back, and was slumped on the ground, clutching her leg. Finally, she passed out from the pain. Eric had broken Anne's leg that I don't know where and went in the end. All I know is that I'm now sitting on Eric's lap again, being held by him. He was looking at me, and I was thinking, could I leave now? Since he already knew that I was wrongly accused, I should be able to leave, right? What are you thinking? His thumb was rubbing against my face. Tony, you can't run away. My heart skipped a beat. He could know what I was thinking, but I couldn't understand him. You see, he was someone who knew me so well. Why didn't he believe me back then? Perhaps it was because love had clouded his judgment? Don't you always want to travel? Shall we go on a trip? His tone was almost pleading. Finally, we boarded the flight to Zhuangbana. As soon as we got off the plane, we went straight to the hotel. I was so sleepy. Eric also lay down. I jolted awake and sat up immediately, looking at him with a guarded expression. Eric rubbed his forehead and said, "I'll go sleep on the sofa." Then, with his 185 centimeters height, he curled up on the sofa like that. Only after making sure that he wouldn't come over did I fall asleep peacefully. Nearly at dawn, I sat up again. Eric was asleep, lying on the floor beside my bed. I didn't wake him up. I went to the toilet barefoot. I was holding a knife in my hand. Before I could make a cut on my leg, the knife was snatched away by Eric. He threw the knife on the ground and checked if I was injured. After making sure I was okay, he carried me back. He didn't say anything, and I didn't know what he was thinking. Go to sleep. I won't do anything to you. I'll just stay here and watch over you. After saying that, Eric tucked me in. He seemed to have aged a lot all of a sudden. It was as if he was the one with depression. He looked gloomy all over. At 5 in the morning, neither of us could sleep. We put on our coats and went out. We were going to watch the sunrise. I couldn't walk, so Eric carried me up the mountain on his back. As he walked, he kept muttering. He said, "Tony, I'm sorry. I brought you back but didn't protect you well." The hand that was holding me on his back tightened a bit, as if he was afraid that I would fall. I buried my face in Eric's neck, and a tear unconsciously rolled down from the corner of my eye. I had been waiting for this apology for 3 years. But things could never go back to the way they were. His foot on the stairs paused for a moment, and then he continued walking. He said again, "Tony, you can hate me, dislike me, but you can't leave me." I could clearly see Eric's Adam's apple twitch. Along the way, he talked a lot to me, from the time he brought me back until I graduated from university. But I didn't listen to much of it. Soon, I fell asleep on his back. But his words didn't stop. He talked more and more energetically. It was as if he wanted to talk about our whole lives. By the time we reached the top of the mountain, the sky was already starting to turn light in the east. He didn't put me down until I woke up. I don't know if it was because he didn't sleep well last night or because he had been crying, but his eyes were red and bloodshot. He wiped the dew-covered bench for me. I sat down. It was still quite early, and there weren't many people around. We just quietly waited for the sunrise. He pulled me into his arms, and I leaned on his shoulder. He said, "Tony, shall we go abroad for treatment?" I shook my head on his shoulder. "It's incurable. Besides, I have gastritis. Taking those medicines would cause strong adverse reactions in my gastrointestinal tract. I would vomit frequently, which would only increase the burden on my body. Let it be like this. It can also be considered a kind of comfort. More and more people were coming and going, and the sunrise was gradually emerging. Suddenly, Eric turned me around to face him. He was looking at me with burning eyes. "Tony, do you still love me?" Then he added, "You can just nod or shake your head." I looked at him. His gaze was no longer the gentle one that I was afraid of, but a burning gaze with my reflection in his eyes. At this moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. People were coming and going, but their noises couldn't reach our ears. Do I still love him? When I was in prison, being bullied, beaten, taking cold showers, and eating stale food, all I had in mind about him was hatred. I'm almost losing the concept of love. For Eric, I no longer have the passion I had in the beginning. I probably don't love him anymore. Eric waited for a long time. As if afraid that I would shake my head, he then said, like a helpless child, "It's okay, Tony. You don't have to pay attention to what I said." I frowned. There were too many people. I was getting annoyed. I pulled Eric's sleeve. I wanted to leave. Back at the hotel, I was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking at the bustling outside world that didn't belong to me after all. Do you want to go out and play? Eric came over. I shook my head. "Tony, can you smile a little?" His eyes were filled with expectation. I was stunned for a moment, and then I shook my head again. I didn't know how to smile. Then, "Tony, can you not be afraid of me?" I remember Tony said that I was the best Eric in the world. Perhaps every time he asked me if I was afraid of him, this was the answer he wanted. I still shook my head. My body was being honest. Eric sighed. "What should I do with you?" I could feel a sense of decadence coming from Eric. But I really didn't want to go out and play, couldn't smile, and couldn't stop being afraid of him. Eric left. I thought he was going to leave me alone in this foreign land. Looking at that, I suddenly stared blankly at a sharp object not far away. There were no knives among them. Eric had asked someone to take them away. My eyes lit up, and I walked towards that sharp object. Just as I touched it, the door opened. It was Eric. He was holding a cat in his arms. His eyes followed my hand, and then he showed an annoyed expression. It was as if he was saying that he shouldn't have left me alone in the room. He put the cat in my arms, and then asked someone to take away the sharp object. "I saw this cat when I went out just now. It's so cute. You should like it." Yes, I like cats, but Eric doesn't. He said that the cat hair would stick to his clothes and make them look dirty. But now he was the one who gave it to me personally. I looked at the cat in my arms. It was very cute, small, and looked so cuddly. Suddenly, it stepped on my chest, climbed onto my face with its head, and licked me. It was a bit itchy, and I giggled. I didn't even realize it myself. Just like that, the two of us and the cat started touring Zishuangbana. It was as if we were going to make up for all the things we hadn't done before. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding the cat in my arms. Eric seemed a bit jealous. He came over and said, "Tony, you have the cat now and don't want me anymore." He sounded a bit aggrieved. I ignored him and stroked the cat in my hands. He didn't care. He hugged me. "What will I do if you leave?" "Tony, I'll go with you. Anyway, my parents died early, and I have nothing to worry about." His tone was very calm, like an old man in his 70s or 80s who had seen through life and death. He rubbed against me, looking so attached and reluctant. I thought for a while and then took his hand and placed it on my stomach. "Tony, are you hungry?" He rubbed my head. I shook my head. I picked up the piece of paper beside me. It said, "Let's have a child?" He didn't agree. He was afraid that my body couldn't bear it. I said that I wanted to leave something to remember, so that I could have a better reincarnation in the next life. Eric took the cat out of my arms and threw it at the end of the bed. Then he carefully kissed me. There's no such thing as a good reincarnation. It's just to leave Eric something to worry about. I know that Eric wasn't joking when he said those words. He always means what he says. I'm afraid that he would really follow me. Yes, I did hate him before. But after all, he had raised me for 12 years. I had enjoyed a good life for 12 years. I couldn't just watch him follow me into the cycle of reincarnation. Not long after, I became pregnant. We returned to Beijing. We had regular checkups. If there was any problem with the child detected, we would give up. We were afraid that the child would be deformed. Fortunately, the child was fine. As for me, I was getting thinner and thinner. I didn't eat much meat. Basically, I got my nutrition from the soup made from chicken or pork ribs. When the child was 7 months old, I could hardly walk. Basically, I went out in a wheelchair. Eric pushed me to the checkup and we met Anne. She wasn't in a good state either. She was walking slowly with a crutch in her hand. Suddenly, she rushed towards us like a madwoman. She took the crutch and swung it at me. However, she was very slow. Before the crutch could come down, it was caught by Eric, who then pushed her to the ground. This action attracted the security guards. Finally, Anne was taken away by the security guards. As for me, I stared at the blood on my pants, not knowing what to do. I gave birth prematurely. The moment I entered the operating room, I grabbed Eric and pointed at the baby, asking him to save the baby. I didn't know if I could make it out of this alive. In a daze, I heard that I seemed to have a massive hemorrhage. There was no stock of my rare panda blood type in the blood bank. It seemed that Eric had brought someone back to transfuse blood for me. The nurse said that the person was Anne. What Anne had taken from me was finally given back to me. The baby was put in an incubator due to being premature. Except for being a bit weak, there was no other problem. It was a boy. As for me, I was still alive, barely hanging on. I had no feeling in my lower body. After giving birth, all my hair fell out within a week. I knew that my vitality was gone. I didn't breastfeed the baby as I was about to die soon. I was afraid that the baby would get addicted to breast milk. As if having a premonition, it seemed that today was my last day. I pointed at the garden outside the window. I wanted to go there and smell the flowers. The smell of disinfectant in the hospital was too strong. I didn't like it. Eric carried me and sat me on the swing. I leaned on his shoulder. Like a flashback before death, I felt that my vocal cords didn't seem so uncomfortable anymore. I tried to open my mouth and said, "Eric." It was hoarse and gentle. Eric looked at me excitedly. "Tony, can you speak now?" I nodded weakly. I said, "Shall we name our baby Coco?" I hoped that our baby would always be happy and carefree in the future. Not like me, spending my whole life full of twists and turns. Eric nodded, his eyes red, without saying a word. I looked at the horizon. It seemed that there were two people who looked a bit like me waving at me. I said, "Eric, I'm going to find my parents." "Look, they're waving at me." There was a faint smile on my lips. "Eric, I'm going to go with my mom and dad. In the next life, let's not meet again. I want to be a good daughter to my mom and dad." I reached out to touch Eric's face. Before I could touch it, my hand fell weakly. Eric pulled that hand to his face. I could feel the temperature on his face. And some unknown liquid dripped down on my head and onto my face. Most likely it was Eric's tears. My consciousness was getting blurrier. I seemed to hear Eric say, "You're leaving me like this in this life. I won't say I love you. If I do, you won't come to find me in the next life." I passed away peacefully like this. It could also be considered a kind of fulfillment. The end. Eric, my name is Eric. When I was 15 years old, I picked up a 10-year-old orphan. That year, my parents had just passed away. I saw that she was pitiful. Maybe it was because I could relate to her situation, so I brought her back. I took good care of her. She gradually grew into a graceful young lady. I also knew her little thoughts. She had once naively said that she loved me and confessed her love to me. I refused. Because of Anne. Why was I with Anne? I don't know. Maybe it was just to make Tony give up on me? At first, when I brought Tony back, I just wanted one more family member. I didn't want this family affection to change, until Anne sent me a message saying that Tony was going to set fire to her villa. Everything changed. When I arrived at Anne's villa, Tony was standing intact at the entrance of Anne's villa. While Anne was trapped inside, I went crazy and dragged Tony inside too. I asked her to save Anne. If she couldn't save her, she would be buried with her. Probably because I didn't believe that the little girl I had raised for 12 years would turn out like this. So, I went crazy and dragged her in too. After Tony was released from prison, I received the notice. I couldn't hold back and drove to pick her up. I met her on the way. But when I thought that the good girl had been spoiled by me, I couldn't help but torture her, wanting her to repent. I guess I had some mental issues. I took her to the auction house. The moment she was on the stage, I regretted it. I didn't expect that they would package Tony like that. She was soaking in the water, looking so alluring. The looks of those men in the venue made me really unhappy. I held back and finally bought her with a bid. In the hospital, she had a fever for 2 days. After she woke up, it happened that Anne was anemic. Out of guilt towards Anne, I used Tony's blood. Maybe subconsciously I regarded Tony as family, so I would feel guilty for the mistakes Tony made. Until Anne threatened Tony, I began to reflect. Was it really Tony who set the fire that year? It wasn't that I had never suspected it, but I had no evidence. I saw that Tony silently took the blame for the incident where Anne tried to hurt her with a knife. I was a bit angry. After that, I took her home to recuperate, but she was very resistant to me. I knew that she had depression, so I slept on her sofa every day. In the second half of the night, she would sit up by herself, sitting on the bed. I didn't know what she was thinking. Occasionally, she would go for a knife. I thought that our relationship had eased a bit and her mood was quite stable, so I went to the company. After working for a while, my heart hurt so much. There was a voice telling me to go back. I heard the conversation between Anne and Tony. In a fit of anger, I broke Anne's leg. I took Tony on a trip. She had always wanted to go, but I had never taken her before. On the way up the mountain, I talked about the past. It turned out that I remembered it so clearly, every detail. The more I talked, the more energetic I became. It turned out that Tony was already so important in my heart. I remembered everything. I have to admit that I fell in love with her. At the top of the mountain, I asked her if she still loved me. She didn't respond. I panicked. I was afraid of hearing an answer that I didn't want, so I didn't let her think about it further, until I brought her a cat. She seemed to be happy for a long time. That was the first time I saw her smile in 3 years. My heart was beating so fast. Tony said that she wanted to give me a child. I knew that the silly woman didn't want me to leave with her. Since this was her last wish, I would fulfill it for her. 18 years later, I was holding flowers and some snacks that she liked, and came to her grave. Tony, I'm here to see you. This time, I won't leave. That brat is very sensible and well behaved. You can rest assured. It seemed that the medicine was taking effect. I leaned weakly on Tony's tombstone, stroking her black and white photo. Tony, why didn't you come to pick me up like your parents did? I miss you so much. You haven't appeared in my dreams in these 18 years. But it doesn't matter. If you don't come to pick me up, then I'll go to find you. You wait for me. I'm going to say I love you. Then, I slowly closed my eyes, as if seeing Tony smiling at me, so dazzling and charming.